3 days before they burned my storage shed down, one of the developers actually smiled at me and said, "You'll thank us when the view opens up." At the time, I thought he was talking about trimming a few trees along the ridge. Turns out, he already knew exactly what was about to disappear. The funny thing about people who think money can solve every problem is that they stop believing anyone else has paperwork, and that little mistake ended up costing them more than the entire shed was ever worth. My name is Nolan Mercer, and until all this happened, I lived a pretty quiet life outside the little town of Ashford Ridge. My place wasn't fancy. It sat on 12 acres my grandparents bought back in the late 70s, long before anybody started throwing around words like luxury development or premium skyline views. My house was small, the barn leaned a little farther every winter, and my old storage shed looked like something held together by memories more than nails, but every board on that property had a story. My father built that shed with 2 neighbors over 3 weekends after I graduated high school. I could still point to the corner where he accidentally drove a nail straight through his boot and laughed harder than the rest of us. Every hunting season, we'd stack firewood against the north wall. Every spring, I'd drag out rusty tools that somehow still worked better than anything brand new from the hardware store. It wasn't valuable to anyone looking at dollars. It was valuable because it was part of my family's life. Then West Haven Development showed up. They bought hundreds of acres on the hill overlooking the valley and announced plans for 3 luxury apartment towers with rooftop lounges, floor-to-ceiling windows, and what every billboard proudly called the most breathtaking panoramic view in the county. Folks around town had mixed feelings. Some welcomed the jobs. Others worried about traffic. I mostly stayed out of it. Their land was their land. Mine was mine. At least that's what I believed. Every now and then I'd notice survey crews standing near my fence line, pointing toward my property. Once I even caught a drone hovering over my shed. I waved at it like an idiot before realizing nobody waves at drones unless they're trying to make a point. A week later, I ran into a project supervisor named Eric at the gas station. Nice boots, expensive truck, spotless sunglasses even though it had just rained. He nodded toward my place and said, "You've got one stubborn old building back there." I laughed and said, "She may be ugly, but she survived longer than most new construction." He chuckled, though there wasn't much humor in it. Well, progress has a way of changing the landscape. I didn't think much about it. People say strange things when they're trying to sound important. Looking back now, I wish I'd paid closer attention. The morning everything changed started before sunrise. I woke up because something smelled wrong. Not campfire smoke. Not somebody burning leaves. This smell was heavier, sharper, the kind that settles in your throat before your brain catches up. I stepped onto the porch with a cup of coffee still in my hand and saw a thin gray ribbon rising beyond the back pasture. My stomach dropped before my coffee hit the ground. I took off running. Gravel slid beneath my boots. The cold morning air burned my lungs. And with every step, I kept telling myself maybe it was brush, maybe lightning hit something, maybe anything except what I already feared. When I reached the clearing, the shed was gone. Not damaged. Not smoking around the edges. Gone. The roof had collapsed into itself. The old cedar walls had turned into black skeletons reaching out of a pile of glowing ash. Tin roofing curled like melted paper clips. My father's workbench had disappeared beneath charred beams. Boxes filled with family photographs, old fishing gear, my grandfather's hand planes, spare tractor parts I'd collected for years. All of it reduced to smoke floating across the field. I just stood there. Sometimes people think grief comes with yelling or crying. Mine didn't. Mine showed up as complete silence. It felt like someone had pressed pause on the whole world. Then I heard voices. About 50 yards away stood 6 construction workers wearing matching jackets with the West Haven logo across their backs. They weren't looking at the fire. They were looking uphill toward the nearly finished apartment buildings. One of them actually lifted his phone and took a picture of the skyline. I followed his eyes, and suddenly I understood. From the upper balconies, there was now a perfect, uninterrupted view across the valley. My shed had been sitting in the exact line of sight. It hadn't been an accident. A man carrying a clipboard noticed me walking toward them. His expression changed for half a second before he forced a polite smile. "Sir," he said, raising both hands. This was a controlled removal during site optimization. We believed that structure had been abandoned. I stared at him long enough to make him uncomfortable. "Abandoned?" I finally asked. "I locked it up around 7 last night after fixing the back door hinge." His smile disappeared. Another worker looked down at his boots. Nobody answered. I took one more step closer. Did anybody knock on my door? Silence. Did anybody check county records? More silence. Did anybody ask who owned the building you decided to burn? The clipboard manager cleared his throat. There may have been a misunderstanding. I looked behind him toward those shiny apartment towers catching the first light of the morning, then back at the ashes still drifting through the air. No, I said quietly. There wasn't a misunderstanding. Somebody made a decision. He opened his mouth again, probably to offer another carefully rehearsed corporate apology, but I turned around before he could finish. There wasn't anything he could say that would bring back what had been sitting in that shed for 40 years. That evening I pulled up an old folding chair and sat in the blackened clearing until after dark. The developer's buildings glowed above the ridge like trophies, every balcony reflecting the moonlight, every window promising somebody an expensive view they were planning to sell. I kept thinking about my father, about all the weekends we'd spent fixing that old shed instead of replacing it, because he always believed if something still had good bones, you respected the work that came before you. Somewhere around midnight, while staring at those towers, an old conversation drifted back into my head. Years earlier, my Uncle Warren had helped settle a property line dispute for one of our neighbors, and during that mess he'd spent weeks digging through planning files at the county office. I remembered him laughing over coffee one morning and saying, "Big developers don't usually get beaten by lawsuits, Nolan. They get beaten by the promises they make to get their permits." At the time, I barely understood what he meant. Sitting there surrounded by ashes, I suddenly wondered if maybe, just maybe, I was finally about to find out. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear dry cedar boards cracking in the fire, and every memory attached to that little building seemed to replay itself one after another. Around 5 the next morning, I gave up pretending I was going to get any rest, poured myself another cup of coffee, and started digging through an old filing cabinet my father had insisted we never throw away. He used to joke that paper outlived people, and for the first time in my life I realized just how right he'd been. Behind faded tax receipts and yellowed warranty cards sat a thick accordion folder labeled property records. Inside were surveys, inspection reports, hand-drawn sketches, and correspondence going back nearly 30 years. I almost missed it, tucked between 2 engineering maps, a copy of an environmental review prepared before West Haven development ever broke ground. My shed was there, marked with a tiny square and a number that looked completely insignificant until I read the notes beside it. Existing agricultural storage structure. Preserve. Fire buffer required. I read that sentence 3 times before it finally sank in. My old shed hadn't simply existed on the property. It had been incorporated into the conditions under which the entire development received approval. Remove the structure without authorization, and the project could fall out of compliance. Suddenly, Uncle Warren's words echoed louder than ever. Big developers get beaten by the promises they make to get their permits. By 8:30, I was walking into the county planning office carrying that folder under one arm and a freshly printed fire department incident report under the other. The woman at the reception desk introduced herself as Linda. She looked like someone who had spent 20 years telling impatient people to take a number, and judging by the stack of paperwork beside her, that was probably true. She smiled politely until I explained why I was there. Then the smile faded. She started flipping through my documents without saying much. Every few pages she'd stop, reread something, then continue. Finally, she looked up and asked, "Did they notify you before removing the structure?" "No." "Did you authorize demolition?" "No." "Did the fire department issue a demolition permit?" "Not that I'm aware of." She quietly stood up, carried my folder into a back office, and closed the door. I waited almost 40 minutes before another man walked out. His name tag read Daniel Harper, Senior Compliance Officer. He shook my hand, invited me into a conference room, and spread every document across the table with the kind of careful attention surgeons give operating instruments. "Mr. Mercer," he said after nearly an hour of reviewing maps and permit conditions, "if these records are accurate, this isn't just a property damage complaint." "What is it?" I asked. He leaned back slowly. "It may be a permit compliance issue." That was the first time I'd heard those words from someone besides my uncle, and somehow they sounded even heavier inside a government office. Mr. Harper asked dozens of questions. When had I last used the shed? Did I have photographs? Insurance records? Utility receipts? I answered everything honestly. Luckily, I still had pictures on my phone from the previous afternoon because I'd been trying to identify a strange hinge my father had installed years earlier. Those photos clearly showed the building standing exactly where it had always been. Before I left, Mr. Harper said something that stuck with me. Don't contact the developer again. Let us do our job. 2 days later, I found out exactly what he meant. A county inspector's truck rolled into the construction site just after sunrise. Then another one arrived. Then 2 state fire officials. By lunchtime, yellow notice boards were posted around several buildings. Workers stood in small groups, pointing at paperwork instead of pouring concrete. Someone told me one crane operator had been ordered to shut down immediately, even though he was halfway through lifting steel onto the upper floors. By the following afternoon, the entire project had stopped. Completely. The silence coming from that hillside was almost eerie. For nearly 2 years, I'd listened to jackhammers, dump trucks, concrete pumps, backup alarms, generators, and shouting from dawn until dinner. Now, nothing. Just wind moving through unfinished buildings. A week later, the local newspaper ran a tiny article on page 4 about an unexpected compliance review delaying construction at the West Haven project. They didn't mention my shed by name, but they did mention possible violations involving fire safety documentation and environmental permit conditions. I clicked the article anyway. Then the investigation started growing. Once inspectors began comparing approved plans with what had actually been built, they discovered things nobody had been looking for. Drainage systems that didn't match submitted engineering drawings. Retaining walls built several feet beyond approved locations. Fire access lanes narrowed to make room for decorative landscaping. Building materials swapped for cheaper alternatives without updated approvals. Every new inspection seemed to uncover 2 more questions. It reminded me of pulling on a loose thread in an old sweater. Nobody expects the whole thing to unravel until suddenly it does. Around that time, I started hearing rumors from people who worked on the site. One electrician told my neighbor the project managers were demanding overtime just to organize paperwork for investigators. Another subcontractor claimed executives were holding emergency meetings every evening trying to figure out who had authorized the removal of my shed. Apparently, everyone blamed someone else. One supervisor blamed the environmental consultant. The consultant blamed the site manager. The site manager blamed an outside demolition crew. The demolition crew insisted they were following verbal instructions. Funny how confidence disappears once lawyers get involved. About 6 weeks into the investigation, I was repairing fence posts when a black SUV pulled into my driveway. 2 men climbed out wearing tailored suits instead of construction boots. The older one introduced himself as Richard Coleman, legal counsel for West Haven Development. The younger man carried a leather briefcase so polished I could practically see my reflection in it. Richard smiled politely, but it wasn't the confident smile I'd seen from Eric at the gas station weeks earlier. This one looked tired. "Mr. Mercer," he began, "we'd like to discuss resolving this unfortunate misunderstanding." I leaned against my shovel. "You mean the misunderstanding where your people burned my building down?" He hesitated. "Mistakes were made. That's different." His smile tightened. "We're prepared to construct a new storage building at no cost to you." "No." The younger lawyer looked surprised. Richard tried again. "We can also include upgraded landscaping, fencing improvements, and a financial settlement." I shrugged. "Still no. Perhaps we should discuss numbers." "You're assuming this is about numbers." That caught them off guard. Richard glanced toward the younger attorney before asking, "Then what is it about?" I looked past them toward the ridge where idle cranes still stood frozen against the sky. "Respect." Neither of them answered. I continued before they could recover. "You people walked onto my land, decided my property was inconvenient, destroyed something that had been standing there longer than most of your employees have been alive, then called it optimization. You didn't make a mistake. You made a choice." For the first time, the younger lawyer spoke. "Mr. Mercer, prolonging this dispute doesn't benefit anyone." I couldn't help smiling a little. "Seems like it's already costing somebody quite a bit." Richard sighed because he knew I wasn't wrong. Public records had become impossible to ignore. Buyers were delaying closings. Investors were asking questions. Subcontractors wanted payment while work sat idle. Every week construction remained frozen. The company lost more money than my property would probably ever be worth. Finally, Richard asked, "What would resolve this?" I had spent days thinking about that question. Not because I wanted revenge for revenge's sake, but because I wanted to make sure nobody else would ever wake up to find strangers deciding their property didn't matter. Here's what I want, I said. You're going to rebuild the shed using fire-resistant materials that meet or exceed current code. You're going to compensate me for every item documented inside that building, including labor, historical materials, and cleanup costs. You're going to reimburse every legal and consulting expense I've incurred. And you're going to file an amended planning agreement acknowledging my property's protected status so nobody from your company or anyone who buys this project ever decides to improve another view by crossing my fence again. Neither lawyer interrupted. Richard slowly removed his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and quietly asked, "If we agree to those terms, will you oppose further corrective filings?" I looked him straight in the eye. "I'll stop opposing you the moment you stop pretending my land exists only when it's convenient for your business." The conversation ended without a handshake. They climbed back into the SUV looking far less certain than when they'd arrived. And as they drove away, I had a feeling the hardest part of this story still wasn't behind either of us. A little over a month after that meeting, Richard called and asked if I would come to their downtown office. I almost laughed because a few weeks earlier those same people hadn't thought I was important enough to knock on my front door before setting my shed on fire. Now they were asking what day worked best for me. Funny how quickly priorities change when a project worth hundreds of millions of dollars is sitting completely still. Their conference room overlooked the very apartment towers that had started this whole mess. Floor-to-ceiling glass, polished wood table, expensive artwork on the walls. The kind of place designed to make visitors feel small. It didn't work anymore. Richard slid a thick settlement agreement across the table and simply said, "We've accepted your conditions." I read every page without rushing. The new shed would be built with steel framing and fire-resistant exterior materials. Every documented tool and family item that could reasonably be valued would be compensated. Cleanup, engineering reviews, legal fees, and additional damages were included. Most important of all, an amended planning document would permanently identify my property and any existing structures as protected features requiring formal review before any future work near the boundary. That paragraph mattered more to me than the dollar amount. Money replaces things. Respect changes behavior. I signed my name, Richard signed his, and neither of us celebrated. We both knew this agreement wasn't really a victory for either side. It was simply the price of a decision that never should have been made in the first place. Construction eventually resumed after months of corrective inspections, revised engineering reports, and more paperwork than I imagined anyone at West Haven ever wanted to see again. The towers were finished, families moved in, lights appeared in the windows, and life kept moving the way it always does. As for me, I spent the following spring helping a local builder put up my new storage shed on the exact same footprint as the old one. Before we poured the foundation, I buried one small charred piece of cedar from my father's original building beneath the corner where the first post would stand. Nobody but me knew it was there. It felt right. Some memories deserve a place in the future instead of being left in the ashes. Every now and then someone driving through town asks if I'm the guy who shut down that big apartment project over a little storage shed. I usually smile and tell them they're asking the wrong question. It was never about the shed. It was about what happens when people with enough money start believing someone else's property is just another obstacle on a blueprint. The shed was only the first domino. Their own choices knocked over the rest. Eric, the supervisor I met at the gas station, actually stopped by about a year later. He looked older, humbler somehow. We stood by the fence for a while without saying much before he finally admitted, "I should have spoken up." I nodded because I already knew he wasn't the one who gave the order, but he hadn't tried to stop it either. Sometimes silence carries its own share of responsibility. Before he left, he looked at the new building and quietly said, "It's nicer than the old one." I smiled. "Yeah, but I would have rather kept the old one." He understood exactly what I meant. These days I still walk out there most evenings with a cup of coffee just before sunset. The new shed catches the orange light differently than the cedar boards ever did, but the view from my porch hasn't changed nearly as much as the people living on that hill probably expected. They got their panoramic skyline in the end, but every permit, every property file, every planning map connected to that development now carries a permanent reminder that one old shed nearly unraveled the entire project. Sometimes I think my uncle would get a good laugh out of that. He always said paperwork was the quietest weapon in America because nobody pays attention to it until it's too late. Looking back, I don't feel like I beat anybody. I certainly didn't burn through their building permit out of revenge alone. They burned down something my family spent decades building, and all I did was insist that the same rules they promised to follow actually meant something. If there's one lesson I carried away from all of this, it's that the smallest structure on a piece of land can hold the biggest legal consequence. And the people who underestimate ordinary homeowners usually end up learning that lesson the expensive way. So now I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have accepted the settlement once they finally admitted they were wrong? Or would you have pushed even harder after everything they put me through? Let me know down in the comments, because I'd honestly like to hear where you draw the line between justice and revenge. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes doing the right thing is always worth the wait, even when it starts with nothing more than a pile of ashes and an old folder full of forgotten paperwork.